She called his childhood nanny a charity case. What he did next? Let's just say, she'll regret it for the rest of her life. The Langston estate was the kind of place that made people stare. Towering columns, a driveway long enough to need a second set of directions, and chandeliers so big they could crush a man if they fell. Inside, everything sparkled. Gold accents, marble floors, and hand-picked art pieces flown in from Europe. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. Victoria Langston made sure of that. Tonight was her night. The annual charity gala, a spectacle she had curated for years, drawing in the wealthiest names in Dallas. Her dress, deep emerald silk, was tailored to perfection, her jewelry catching the light with every elegant gesture. Guests murmured admiration as she floated from conversation to conversation, accepting compliments like they were owed to her. Then she noticed her husband. Daniel Langston, the self-made millionaire, stood near the entrance, his back straight but his expression softer than usual. And in front of him? An elderly black woman, small in frame but standing tall, her dark grey dress simple but dignified. She wasn't a guest, not one of their kind. Victoria's brow furrowed. She moved closer, just enough to hear. "Miss Hattie," Daniel said, his voice warm, his smile easy. "You came." The woman nodded, her eyes shining. "Of course, baby. Couldn't miss this." Baby. Victoria's lips pressed together. Who was this woman? A passing server handed her a flute of champagne, but she barely noticed. Daniel was hugging her now. Not a polite, distant embrace, but something familiar, something intimate, like he actually cared. Victoria's heels clicked against the marble as she stepped forward. "Daniel," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "aren't you going to introduce me?" Daniel turned, still smiling, but something flickered in his eyes. He knew that tone. "Of course," he said. "Victoria, this is Miss Hattie. She practically raised me." Victoria's polite mask didn't slip, but inside, something twisted. Raised him. Miss Hattie chuckled, her voice like old vinyl, worn but still rich. "Oh, I didn't do much. Just made sure he ate, stayed out of trouble, and knew right from wrong." Victoria tilted her head, her smile sharp. "Well, isn't that sweet? But I wasn't aware we were inviting staff." The room didn't go silent, but the shift was there. The kind of subtle pause that only the most socially aware would notice, the kind of tension that lingers just under polite conversation. Daniel's smile faltered. "Miss Hattie isn't staff." "Oh." Victoria sipped her champagne, feigning ignorance. "Then what is she?" Miss Hattie's expression didn't change. She had seen this before. Women like Victoria, wealthy, polished, but brittle when scratched. "I'm family," she said simply. Victoria's laugh was light, almost airy. "Well, isn't that something?" She turned to Daniel, her voice still sweet, but just a touch too loud. "Darling, I didn't realize we were opening our home to charity cases tonight." Miss Hattie said nothing. Daniel said nothing. But something in the air shifted. Something that Victoria wouldn't see coming. But she would soon realize. Some moments can't be undone. A soft clink of silverware against crystal punctuated the air. A few guests glanced in their direction, sensing the tension. Most pretended not to hear, their smiles stiff as they refocused on their wine glasses. But the moment had landed. Victoria had made sure of that. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was never one for public scenes, but something about the way she had said it, the dismissiveness, the entitlement, stirred something deep in his chest. He turned to Miss Hattie, his expression unreadable. "You hear that, Miss Hattie?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. "My wife thinks you're a charity case." Miss Hattie exhaled softly, not in sadness, but in understanding. She had been here before. Not in this exact ballroom, not in this exact dress, but in the presence of women like Victoria. the ones who mistook money for worth. She smiled gently. "Oh, baby," she said, shaking her head. "I've been called worse." That should have been the moment Victoria stepped back. That should have been her chance to read the room, to see the way Daniel's shoulders had squared, the way some of the guests had lowered their voices, suddenly far more interested in the drama unfolding than the 5-figure bottle of champagne in their hands. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned in. "Well," she said, tilting her glass slightly, letting the golden liquid swirl. "I just think it's so admirable how some people cling to the past. I mean, Daniel was, what? A child when you—" she gestured vaguely. "Worked for his family. That was decades ago. And yet here you are." She laughed, shaking her head as if she truly found it amusing. "It's sweet, really, holding on like that." Miss Hattie smiled, but not the kind Victoria was used to. It wasn't polite. It wasn't fake. It was knowing. "Oh, honey," Miss Hattie said, her voice still as steady as ever. "You think I'm the one holding on?" Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. "I just mean—" "You don't mean anything," Daniel interrupted, his voice low, controlled. "You just assume." The shift was instant. Victoria turned sharply toward him, eyebrows raising ever so slightly. "Excuse me?" Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "You assume you know me, know what matters to me, know who I value. But let me ask you something, Victoria. When's the last time you actually listened to me?" A hush settled over the small group around them. This wasn't just a passing exchange anymore. This was something else. Something real. Victoria forced a laugh. "Oh, come on, Daniel, don't be dramatic. It was just an observation." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It wasn't." For the first time that night, Victoria felt something unfamiliar curl in her stomach. It wasn't embarrassment. She was used to attention. It wasn't discomfort. She knew how to navigate sharp conversations. It was something worse. It was the feeling of losing control. And Daniel wasn't done. "You see, the thing about Miss Hattie," he continued, stepping closer, his voice carrying now, "is that she didn't work for my family. She raised me. She was there when my parents weren't. She was the one who made sure I had food when they were out closing deals. She was the one who stayed up when I had nightmares. She was the one who—" He stopped, just for a second, just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then, softer. "She was the one who loved me." Victoria's mouth parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. Daniel turned to Miss Hattie now, his voice gentler. "And she's never asked me for anything." A heavy pause. And then, Victoria did the only thing she knew how to do. She scoffed. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes, her tone teetering on mockery. "Don't tell me you're actually falling for this. You're a grown man, Daniel. You don't need a nanny anymore." Daniel turned fully to her now, and the way he looked at her, it wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was clarity. "I don't need a nanny," he agreed, nodding slightly. "But I do need people in my life who actually care about me." Victoria blinked. For the first time, she felt the weight of the room shifting. Guests weren't just watching anymore. They were judging. Whispers drifted through the crowd like ripples in water. "Did you hear what she said? She called her a charity case, right in front of him." "Oh, this is not going to end well for her." Victoria turned, looking for an ally. But the faces around her, all the ones who had smiled so eagerly just an hour ago, were blank now. Neutral at best. Distant at worst. Her grip tightened around the champagne glass, though now it felt less like a symbol of power and more like a prop she didn't know what to do with. But she still had one thing. Daniel was her husband. He would get over this. They would go home, and he would cool off, and she would find a way to turn this around, wouldn't he? She smiled, placing a careful hand on his arm. "Darling," she said, her voice softer now, coaxing. "Let's not make a scene." Daniel looked down at her hand. Then, very deliberately, he stepped back. And that was when Victoria realized she had already lost. But the night was far from over, and Daniel wasn't done shocking her yet. A hush settled over the room, the kind of silence that only happens when something real is unfolding. Victoria could feel it now, slipping. Her control, her carefully curated image, the security of being his wife. The champagne in her hand suddenly tasted bitter. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw before stepping forward. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "You know, Victoria, there's something I've never really told you." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "Something I never thought I'd need to tell you." Victoria forced another soft laugh, the kind meant to smooth things over. "Daniel, let's not turn this into some—" But he didn't stop. "You've always loved telling people I'm self-made, that I built my company from the ground up, that I pulled myself up, worked hard, made smart choices." His voice tightened just slightly. "But do you know who made that possible?" Victoria blinked. "Well, you did, obviously." Daniel shook his head, cutting her off. "No, she did." He turned toward Miss Hattie, his expression raw in a way Victoria had never seen before. "She's the reason I even had a chance." Miss Hattie opened her mouth, but Daniel gently held up a hand, his voice thick. "No, Miss Hattie. Let me say this." The guests were no longer pretending to sip their drinks or make conversation. They were watching, absorbing every word. Daniel turned back to Victoria. "You love throwing these galas, donating to charities, making speeches about giving back." His eyes darkened. "But the real charity happened in houses like the one I grew up in." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Daniel, this is really not the time." "It is the time." He took a step closer. "You want to talk about the past? Let's talk about it. About how my parents were too busy growing their empire to raise their own son. About how I had to schedule time just to see them. About how they provided everything, except the one thing I actually needed." His voice dropped lower, and suddenly it was just him and her. Love. Victoria felt something in her chest twist, but she held her ground. "Daniel, we're at a party." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Exactly. A party. Where you felt so comfortable humiliating the only person in this room who actually gave a damn about me before I had money." His voice hardened. "And that tells me everything I need to know about you." Victoria's pulse quickened. She glanced around, realizing just how many eyes were on her now. Eyes that weren't admiring. They were waiting. But Daniel wasn't finished. "You know what's funny?" He shook his head, chuckling to himself. "I always thought my biggest fear was ending up like my parents, too busy chasing success to notice the people who mattered." His jaw clenched. "Turns out, I married someone just like them instead." That landed. Victoria's fingers twitched at her side. She had always prided herself on never losing composure. But this was public. "You're being ridiculous," she said, voice clipped. "I was just making an observation." Daniel's eyes burned into her. "No, you were showing me who you really are." Victoria's throat tightened. The air felt too thick, too exposed. She needed to turn this back around, regain some ground. "Oh, come on, Daniel. She was a nanny. You act like she was a mother when I didn't have one." His voice was firm, unshakable. "And you—" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're a woman who thinks the only people worth respect are the ones with a bank account that matches yours." Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came. Daniel nodded to himself, as if something inside him had just clicked. Then he turned back to Miss Hattie. "I should have done this a long time ago." Miss Hattie blinked up at him. "Baby, you don't have to." "I do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I wouldn't be here without you." Then, right there in front of everyone, he did something no one expected. He took her hands, kissed them, and then he turned to the crowd. "I want you all to know something." His voice rang clear, cutting through the weight of the room. "This woman isn't just a guest tonight. She's the reason I have anything to give." People shifted, glancing at each other, unsure what to say. Daniel continued. "She didn't just feed me. She didn't just watch me. She taught me right from wrong. She taught me how to be a man. She gave me the kind of love that money can't buy." His eyes flickered to Victoria. "The kind some people will never understand." Victoria's breath came short now. This wasn't just about the gala anymore. This was personal. Daniel turned back to Miss Hattie. "I know my parents paid you, but I also know they never really saw you. Not the way they should have." He swallowed. "But I do." Miss Hattie's lips pressed together, her hands trembling slightly in his. "You never asked me for a thing," Daniel said softly, "but I'm giving you one anyway." Victoria's stomach twisted before she even heard the words. "I've changed my will." The room gasped. Victoria stilled. Daniel continued, unfazed. "Miss Hattie, when I go, you won't have to worry about anything ever again." Victoria's breath hitched. Daniel turned to her now, his voice colder. "You always assumed my money would stay in this marriage, that you'd be the one to decide where it goes." His jaw tightened. "But you assumed wrong." A sharp silence followed. Victoria froze. Daniel was cutting her out. Right here. Right now. Someone dropped a glass. A small shatter echoed in the distance. The humiliation burned through Victoria's skin. Her pulse pounded. This wasn't just some argument. This was destruction. Her reputation. Her marriage. Her future. And worst of all, she could see it in his face. Daniel wasn't bluffing. He meant every word. But the worst part, Victoria had just begun to realize she was losing more than just money. She was losing the one person who had ever truly cared. The gala was ruined. People weren't laughing. They weren't clinking glasses or posing for photographers anymore. They were watching. Watching her. Victoria stood frozen, her mind racing, her skin prickling with heat. She had spent years curating her image, cementing herself as the queen of Dallas high society. And now, in a matter of minutes, she had become a spectacle. Daniel turned away from her, his focus solely on Miss Hattie. "You deserve more than just words," he told her gently. "And I should have done this years ago." Miss Hattie swallowed hard, her eyes glassy. "Baby, I don't need—" "It's not about need," Daniel cut in, his voice firm but kind. "It's about what's right." The weight of his words settled in Victoria's chest like a brick. This wasn't just a gesture. This was a message. She had spent years living under the assumption that, no matter what, Daniel would always choose her. That her status as his wife guaranteed her a certain level of protection, power, control. But now he was making it clear. She had mistaken his patience for permanence. Victoria's nails dug into her palm. "Daniel," she started, forcing her voice into something softer, something pleading. "Let's talk about this privately." Daniel turned to her, and the look in his eyes sent ice through her veins. "Now you want privacy." His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the sharp edge beneath it. Whispers swirled around them, small pockets of murmured shock rippling through the crowd. Victoria scanned the faces in the room, searching for an ally. But no one met her eyes. The same people who had once fawned over her, who had waited on her approval, were suddenly indifferent, distant. And that was when she understood. Power in this world was not just about money. It was about influence, about the perception of control. And tonight, Daniel had made sure she lost both. Her chest tightened. She needed to fix this. "Darling, you're upset," she tried, her voice honeyed, her hand reaching for his. "I didn't mean—" Daniel stepped back before she could touch him. Her fingers curled into a fist. He wasn't going to let her sweep this away. Not this time. The weight of humiliation pressed against her ribs as the realization fully hit. She had pushed too far. And now she was paying for it. Miss Hattie placed a gentle hand on Daniel's arm. "Baby, don't do anything out of anger." "This isn't anger," Daniel said, his voice steady. "This is clarity." Victoria's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment everything shifted. The moment she lost the man who had built the life she clung to so tightly. And the worst part? She had done this to herself. But Victoria wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, and she wasn't going to let go without a fight. Victoria felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The stares, the whispers, the slow unraveling of everything she had built. She could fix this. She had to fix this. Straightening her shoulders, she forced a tight smile. "Daniel, let's not be rash. We've built a life together. Our life. You can't seriously be thinking of—" Daniel didn't even let her finish. "I'm done thinking, Victoria." His voice was firm, cold. "I spent years making excuses for you. Years believing that underneath all of this—" He gestured vaguely at the glimmering room, the expensive gown, the carefully curated mask she wore. There was something real. His jaw tensed. "But I was wrong." The room was silent. Victoria's pulse thundered in her ears. "You're being dramatic," she whispered harshly, still trying to keep her voice light, controlled. "This is ridiculous. You're going to throw away everything we've built over her?" Daniel took a slow breath. And then he smiled. Not the warm, easy smile she had been used to, but something sharper. "I'm not throwing anything away," he said. "I'm just finally giving to the person who actually deserves it." Victoria's throat tightened. Miss Hattie shook her head softly. "Baby, I don't want to be the reason for trouble." Daniel turned to her, his expression softening. "You're not. She is." Victoria flinched. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward Victoria. A legal document. A revised will. Victoria's breath caught. He had already done it. Her name was nowhere on the document. Her hands trembled as she looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You're serious?" Daniel held her gaze. Completely. And with that, he turned to Miss Hattie, offering his arm. "Let's get you out of here." Miss Hattie hesitated, then took it, letting him guide her through the stunned crowd. The room seemed to part for them, guests stepping aside as whispers turned to quiet murmurs. Victoria stood frozen in place, alone, powerless. For the first time in her life, she had nothing left to hide behind. And as she watched Daniel walk away, it hit her. She had won the marriage, but lost the man. Money can buy luxury, but it can't buy loyalty. The people who stand by you when you have nothing are the ones who truly matter. Treat them like they're disposable, and one day you'll realize you're the one who's been left behind. Think about the people in your life who have stood by you, even when they had nothing to gain. Have you truly appreciated them? Let this be a reminder. Wealth isn't about what's in your bank account. It's about the love, the respect, and the integrity you carry with you. Don't wait until it's too late to see who really matters.